Shabbat Shalom, Evelyn. Good to see you. Hey, Nicole from Costa Rica. Shabbat Shalom. Really great to see you. Shabbat Shalom, honey. Hi, Bella. How are you, honey? Shabbat Shalom. So good to see you with us. It's good to see everyone. Welcome to Sabbath Collective. We are a community of people interested in celebrating the Sabbath and pursuing God through a Hebraic worldview of the Bible. Hey, Rebecca, great to see you. Shabbat Shalom. We're actually on part 3 now of a series on Esther. And there are some Esther enigmas we've been talking through. So we started with the meaning of the names in Esther. In Persian, Esther means star. And star in this time and place was actually something that leads and that influences, which is pretty interesting because God's chosen people, the Jews, who Esther is actually among, are actually now in exile. Jerusalem, or as we say Jerusalem, was conquered. Its people, all of them, were taken into chains into Babylonian captivity. And although Persians now rule at the time of Esther and have allowed some Jews to return to Jerusalem, there are still diaspora Jews who have married and settled and made their homes in Susa, living as a recognized religious minority in the heart of this powerful Persian empire. So Esther's parents have died, and she's actually being raised by a cousin, Mordecai. As an orphan, and a female, and a Jew, Esther is a nobody among nobodies in this marginalized community. And on top of that, she is actually tapped to be taken into the king's harem. The root of the Hebrew word Esther is actually seter, and it means hidden, to be hidden or concealment. So you see some, but you don't see the whole picture, so to speak. So Esther becomes queen, but no one knows she is a Jew. So she is the hidden savior. Esther has an additional name, Hadassah, which means myrtle. And it looks like this. It's one of the 4 species used in the Sukkot festival for worship. And if you remember, each species represents a way to serve the Lord. And myrtle symbolizes to see. So there's these seemingly contrasting images in these names of concealment and yet shining, which leads, and then there's sight. So then on top of that, you can't find the name of the Lord in the book of Esther. There's a suggestion of an acrostic spelling it out, but we don't find his name overtly. We don't read anything about God in the book of Esther. And that's a little unusual that the Lord is unseen in a book of the Tanakh. So God also is hidden from plain sight in this book. So let's go over the backstory again, because it's been a couple weeks, just in case you've forgotten. Esther is actually a very powerless orphan, a woman, also powerless in this time and culture. And she's part of, hey Barika, great to see you. She's part of this powerless group of people, the Jews. And the extremely powerful king of this hugely vast region, Ahasuerus, was looking for a new wife. The former wife, the queen, wouldn't fit the mold. She was outspoken on behalf of her own honor, and therefore she was divorced and cast out of the kingdom. So after a search for the new queen of Persia, the king chose Esther. Now, again, I said this previously, but this was not an every girl's dream moment of being in a beauty pageant, as some silly Western pastors choose to teach this. These were actually young girls who were taken from their families and their communities. And in this particular situation, they would either be made the queen, or if they weren't picked as queen, they would be put into the king's harem, which was a bunch of women that he could have sex with whenever he wanted to. And they were isolated from the outside and from their family. Yes, the size of the kingdom is mind-blowing. Hey, Tanya, good to see you, honey. So Esther actually is picked to be the queen of Persia. And Mordecai, her cousin, her adoptive parent, as it were, is enabled to sit in the palace gates. So that's right outside of the palace. And as he's sitting outside the palace gates, he hears about an assassination plot against the king. And he goes and informs Esther. And then Esther goes and tells the king. So the assassination attempt is thwarted. So Mordecai is this kind of hero at this moment, quiet and behind the scenes, but he's actually saved the king's life. And we're going to talk about how that factors in next week. We talked previously about chance or providence as it relates to the name Purim connected to Esther. This is one of those things that look like by chance. Mordecai happened to be there at the gates when these two guys were kind of conspiring to murder the king. But is it really chance? So now enter the antagonist, the bad guy. Haman is his name. And he is a narcissistic, power-grabbing man who is made second to the king. Hey, sissy, great to see you. He is a man who has a lot of power, and he loves that power, and he loves being bowed down to and honored. Mordecai, however, refuses to bow down in the idolatrous way that this was presented, and it really sets off Haman. So Haman vows to kill Mordecai. And not just Mordecai, but all the people who were just like him, all of the Jewish people. And by the way, I think we can really relate to this because power-hungry narcissists don't change. This is typical of narcissists. This paranoia and this obsessive threat mentality, right? So the king is manipulated by Haman into annihilating all of the Jews, into actually issuing this decree. And if you missed the Esther teaching on March 23rd, please go back and watch that and see what an evil person uses to inject fear into those they need on their side. So these sort of egomaniacal, power-hungry manipulators thrive in a culture of paranoid fear of people that are different than them. So the king does what Haman wants him to do. He issues an edict to eliminate all of the Jews from the kingdom. And there were millions of them. And take note here, the king doesn't even have the information he needs to make this kind of decision. Annihilating millions of people could take time and resources, could redirect the military's attention as well. And there's not even an assessment of what that would mean to the economy, removing this many people. So Haman, the bad guy, gets the king to make this kind of reactionary decision without any logic. Hello, political and religious leadership of today. Times don't change, right? Haman was a very real threat to the people of God, and he had very real power. George R.R. Martin, who writes in A Game of Thrones, "Give me honorable enemies rather than ambitious ones, and I'll sleep more easily by night." Let me read this again because it's a really great quote for all of you A Game of Thrones enthusiasts. "Give me honorable enemies rather than ambitious ones, and I'll sleep more easily by night. Haman is the scariest kind of enemy. He is ambitious for power and he is without honor, no code. Some years ago, we were dealing with an obsessed enemy, and one of our advisors said some very wise and powerful words. He said, you have to get out. There's no winning this. You can't fight someone who has the power to make the rules and then keeps changing them. And that was really the situation that Haman put himself in with the Jewish people. So Exodus 3, verse 15 says, at the king's order, the runners went out quickly, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the capital. Then the king and Haman sat down for a drink together, but the city of Shushan was thrown into confusion. This is one of the most terrifying verses in the Bible. It really shows us who these two characters are. So Haman becomes the puppet master behind the throne. He has this strong influence over the king. And both of them are completely disassociated from the human beings in this Holocaust that is about to happen. There is pandemonium with the Jewish people because they find out that their heads are on the butcher block. And here we read in this text, these two decide to have a glass of wine together. There is a complete disconnect to the humanity. It kind of reminds me, hey, Aaron, so great to see you from the West Coast. Good luck, break a leg in that show, Hamilton. Love you. So it reminds me of a place that I went to years ago in Ghana that was a slave fortress. It's a sort of museum today. And you went into this place where these Ghanaians were taken captive and put into this kind of prison. It was really more like these caves. And above the caves, this prison where people would come in as prisoners but actually go out on the slave ships to cross the Atlantic to become slaves, above this place was a palace, an opulent palace that was built and occupied by various European governments over the years, right over the prison. And right underneath their feet, where they were holding parties and eating and dancing, literally right under their feet, were the men, the women, and the children chained in darkness. There was a complete detachment from humanity. And when you walked into that place in Ghana, the air was so thick with sorrow, even all these hundreds of years later, that it literally took your breath away. This detachment from humanity is the same detachment we see with Haman, the bad guy, and the king. So the king agrees to annihilate the Jewish people on a specific day. Meanwhile, Mordecai learns of the plan and puts on sackcloth and ashes, which is a typical thing that Jewish people did when they're mourning. It's this scratchy material, and he puts ashes on his head. He's mourning publicly. He's standing in public mourning. And word gets back to Esther about Mordecai doing this. And she sends clothing for him, like, Uncle Mordecai or Cousin Mordecai, cover up, which he refuses. So she tries to stop it. Maybe she thinks someone may find out he's a Jew and maybe he's going to embarrass himself and me. Esther didn't even know of the king's decree. So if you have your Bibles and you're reading this with me, I use the complete Jewish version. You can use whatever version you have. I'm going to read some text here. It says, so Esther summoned Hataka. This is Esther 4, verses 5 through 14. Hatak, one of the king's officials attending her, and instructed him to go to Mordecai and find out what this was all about and why. Hatak went out to Mordecai in the open space in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him and exactly how much silver Haman had promised to put in the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the decree for their destruction issued in Shushan. so that he could show it to Esther, explain it to her, and then instruct her to approach the king, intercede with him, and implore his favor on behalf of all of her people. Hatak returned and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and gave him this message for for Mordecai. All the king's officials, Esther says, as well as the people in the royal provinces, know that if anyone, man or woman, approaches the king in the inner courtyard without being summoned, there is just one law. He must be put to death, unless the king holds out the gold scepter for him to remain alive. And I haven't been summoned to the king for the past 30 days. So let's push pause on the text there. Esther is a Jew. The king doesn't know that. So there's a certain hiddenness, maybe even shame of being found out. She's not supposed to identify with a people group. Remember, she's Mother Persia, let alone a marginalized people group that are slated for annihilation. So oftentimes when we have to step up to something, we shy away from courageous involvement because we think, I'm not completely without something hidden myself. Maybe, I smoked marijuana in college, but I didn't inhale, right? So Esther may feel a bit shaky, not on good grounds. Have you ever felt not worthy to do what you were feeling called to do because you felt like, no, I'm not perfect. Maybe somebody else is better suited for that. Maybe I have a skeleton or two in my closet. And if she enters his presence without being called, if Esther goes into the presence of the king without being called and he doesn't extend that golden scepter to her, she'll be put to death just like that. So people's choices and their decisions are a big part of this story that talks about deliverance but doesn't use the name of God, suggesting that people have a huge part to play in Adonai's plan for salvation. So Esther is first filled with fear. And she says, my husband hasn't called me for 30 days. Now remember, she got to the position of queen because the former queen was too bold in fighting for her own rights. And we can assume the king doesn't sleep alone. So in other words, the king has this huge harem. And he's probably not sleeping alone. So he hasn't called Esther. He was probably sleeping with somebody else. So maybe she felt like she wasn't desirable to him any longer. Again, she felt like she had no power. Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple, says this great thing here. Unbelievable quote. The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. So let me ask you this, and let me see your comments. Why do you feel that we're so quick to give up the power we have, or not even see it at all? Rebecca says she definitely feels that way when she got fired and some of my life dreams got shattered. Absolutely. So why do you feel that we are so quick to give up the power that we have, or that we can't even see our own power at all? Do you think it's, as Maya Angelou says, we fear our own glory with the responsibility that it may carry? Why are we so quick to give up the power that we have? And while I'm waiting for those comments, I want to tell you a story that I remember from a very old woman, an abuela, a Hispanic woman living back when our family lived in Bushwick, Brooklyn, years ago, almost 30 years ago. It was a very dangerous time back then. Rebecca says, I think the way our society is designed so that those on the lower end of the social scale don't realize they have that they have power. Absolutely. So Rebecca is suggesting that we live in a system that is intentionally trying to keep people with power into a place where they feel like they have none. And that is systemic. And I completely agree there with you, Rebecca. Barika says the same thing. I don't know why. Sometimes I do it as a self-preservation. Good, Barika. Sometimes we preserve ourselves in that way because we're afraid if we put ourselves up that we're going to be attacked. And sometimes that's a very real threat. Nicole says, feeling as if somebody else could do it better. Really good thing too. And I think we all see that. Once we feel that responsibility, we think surely it has to be somebody else. It can't be me. So back to this abuela in Bushwick, Brooklyn. There was an older woman. She was probably in her early 60s. And every day, this older woman, and again, this was when Bushwick was a completely different kind of city. And it was very different, very dangerous. And there was a lot of young men and young women who were walking around with visible guns in their belt. And so a lot of these people were drug dealers, and what they tried to do was recruit these young children to be their runners. Because if you got caught when you were 9, 10, running drugs, you didn't necessarily go to prison. And then also these young kids, 8, 9, 10, weren't tempted to steal the drugs themselves. So these older kids, and when I say older kids, they were babies themselves, 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, walking around with guns in their pants, were coming up to the little kids and offering them things like sneakers and more money than what they've ever seen if you would take this package to this store over here. And they would recruit at the school. So there was this abuela who would walk with all 5 of her grandchildren every day to school. And they ranged in ages. And every morning, this older woman walked with a broom in her hand. And she walked these kids to school. And you know what? That broom wasn't stronger than a gun. But none of those kids, those older kids, those drug dealers, bothered these grandchildren of this woman. Somehow, this woman knew her own power. And you know what? Other people knew it too. So this is a very real thing that we can step into. So let's continue with the text then that we were reading. It goes on, upon being told what Esther had said, Mordecai asked them to give Esther this answer. Don't suppose that merely because you happen to be in the royal palace, you will escape any more than the other Jews. For if you fail to speak up now, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from a different direction. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows whether you didn't come into your royal position precisely for such a time as this? And most of us have heard this phrase many times. So Mordecai challenges her with 2 pretty cool and important truths. The first thing he says, and I'm going to paraphrase what he's really saying. He told her, if you don't step up, you're going to die. And I'm going to paraphrase that by saying, if you don't risk losing everything, you will lose everything. So that's a funny thing to say to a person who's afraid to lose their footing or their safety, right? Yes, they will find out you are a Jew, Mordecai says, so own it, because you can't hide. So we have to identify with the people we are called to fight for. There can't be this kind of chasm in between us and them, or we will not be willing to risk anything. Mordecai is saying here, if you find yourself in a position and you are not willing to risk loss, to do what is right, you'll lose anyway. Be willing to accept the price it may cost you. So let's ask ourselves, and let me see your comments on this. What complicit agreements do we make with cultural or political powers to maintain our own status and privilege? And while I'm waiting for those comments, I'm going to tell you another story. I knew a young woman a couple years ago who was an attorney, and she was working very hard to become a partner. She was a brilliant attorney, and she invested her whole self into this track that she was on. She did not get married. She did not have any children. She really didn't even have a social life. She was all about trying to become a partner at this very prestigious law firm she worked for. But she was constantly subjected to sexist humor, off-color stories, men trying to get her into the closet with them, men brushing up against her body parts, all kinds of inappropriate behavior. And she came to me for counseling. And my response was, well, if you don't like the culture at this law firm, you either have to leave it or you have to change it. Those are the only two options there. You either have to leave it or you have to change it. Hey, Phoebe, great to see you out in Cali. And her response back to me was, I can't do either. This is one of the best firms in the country. I can't change this culture. It's far too powerful, and I don't want to quit. Because if I make partner, I can go anywhere, and this is what I've been using my whole life to move towards. So this is a very real issue that we all face. And once we understand that, and once we understand that we're put in this position, we have to count the cost of what we're possibly giving up. So that female attorney ended up leaving and going to a small firm that was owned and run by all women. Now, she didn't feel like she wanted to go and challenge the culture. She didn't feel like she wanted to go to HR. She didn't feel like she wanted to have a lawsuit because she felt like that was really going to ruin her career, but she did feel like she wanted to leave it. And she went into this law firm, and she would not make what she would have had she had stayed. She didn't make that kind of money. She didn't have that kind of prestigious job, but she was willing to pay that price for what was right. The second thing Mordecai said is, you have been brought to this place for such a time as this. Just such a great line. So where you find yourself right now has a purpose. Right at this moment. You were brought here. You didn't get here on your own because you were pretty or talented or smart, he says. See, people hold so tightly to where they've fought hard to get. But here's Esther's truth, and here's ours. Unless your position, you use your position, your talents, your resources to advance the kingdom, and that is bringing God's justice into your world. And get this, listen to this, your palace becomes your prison. Your palace becomes your prison. So you can think you're in a comfortable place, you can think you're in a place where it's going according to your plan, but unless you're willing to do what needs to be done, that place, that palace becomes your prison. This is what Mordecai said to Esther. Have you ever heard about an injustice and realized I have no other choice but to act? That can look like all different things for all different people, right? We all have that kind of situation happen. Rebecca says, I think that mainstream culture, that kind of self-reflection takes a lot. It absolutely does. And sometimes we're not willing to give up the power. Absolutely. So this can look like a lot of different things, but it's action that risks. Sometimes it risks everything. So let's go on with the text. It says, Esther had them return this answer to Mordecai. Go assemble all the Jews to be found in Shushan and have them fast for me, neither eating nor drinking for 3 days, night and day. Also, I and the girls attending me will fast the same way. This is Esther saying this. Then I will go into the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Then Mordecai went his way and did everything Esther had ordered him to do. That's the end of the reading. She risked her life to stand up for justice, to identify with her people and mediate for them before the king, which is against the law. Esther calls a fast. I'll do it. If I die, I die. Esther is the one giving the directives now, but it's not over. We'll see how she navigates these waters next week. We may not understand why at the time we are being challenged to risk. We can't see God anywhere, but we all find ourselves in specific places at specific times for a purpose. And the lives of others depend on your decisions. So don't give in to that fear. Do that work you're put there to do. Risk your comfort. Esther faces fear and chooses courage. If I perish, I perish. She's not denying that she's afraid and she could die. She's saying it's worth it because this is the right decision to make. God's people were threatened, and yet that threat would not prevail. Providence would save them, and it would actually be done through a young woman. To heal the world, it takes all kinds of people in all kinds of positions saying yes to identify with and mediate for others. Artists and construction workers and teachers and doctors and restaurant workers and police and people in the financial system. Everyone can make that choice. I've known so many people who look at their jobs or in their neighborhoods and look at it as they're waiting until they go somewhere else to do something. No. You've been brought to where you're at. Esther is working for justice from within the palace courts that she finds herself in. She has no real power, and yet she has been put in this position. And she is the savior of her people. It's incredible. Ephesians 2:10 says, "For we are of God's making, created in union with the Messiah Yeshua for a life of good actions, already prepared by God for us to do." Look, already prepared by God for us to do. The Greek word is poema, which means that which has been created by God. It's where we get our word poem. We are God's poetry. Already prepared for what he has for us to do. You have been creatively designed by Yahweh for certain things in this world that only you can do in your way. Trust that design he's given you, and that the Lord has you right where you are for such a time as this. And know this, you're ready. We're going to close our time together a bit before sundown with the lighting of the Shabbos candles. And traditionally, the mothers of the home light the Sabbath candles. And those Sabbath candles connect us to the Sabbath light of peace, of joy, and of unity. And then the tradition is that she encircles the candles with her hands 3 times, which is a gesture that welcomes in the Sabbath. And then she prays as she covers her eyes from the flame, which is a symbol of ending all work. Blessed are you, Yahweh our God, King of the universe, who has set us apart by his commandments, who has given us Yeshua the Messiah, and has set us to be a light to the world. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.